Railroaded: The Targeting and Caging of Ross Ulbricht. Episode 4 of a 6-part series. This episode includes chapters 15 through 17, The Cover-Up, Eviscerating the Defense, and How Many DPRs. Chapter 15, The Cover-Up. Joshua Draytell, criminal defense attorney, said, "It is obvious the government is more interested in protecting its unfairly obtained conviction of Mr. Ulbricht than investigating fully or effectively the misconduct of its corrupt agents. This is a continuing travesty of justice." Once Ross was arrested and the Silk Road website seized, Force and Bridges were under pressure. If it were discovered that they sold inside information to DPR, extorted and threatened him, broke into the site through Green's accounts, and used that access to steal funds, they would both be sent to prison. In April 2014, Force started using Tor to connect to Bitstamp, a Bitcoin exchange similar to Mt. Gox. As part of their fraud and theft prevention procedures, Bitstamp inquired as to why he was using Tor to access their site. "I utilize Tor for privacy," Force told them. "Don't particularly want NSA looking over my shoulder." Smiley face. Bitstamp's management found Force's reply strange and froze his account immediately. A few days later, Force got help from Bridges, who convinced Bitstamp to unfreeze Force's account, allowing him to make additional transfers. Force then emailed Bitstamp and asked them to delete all transaction history associated with his account, but it was already too late. California AUSA Catherine Hahn opened an official investigation into both Force and Bridges that same day. By early May, Force resigned from the DEA and quickly began hiding the money he'd extorted and stolen. He wired $235,000 to an offshore account in Panama just a few days after learning of the government's investigation. By the end of May, he had legal representation and attended an official interview where he was interrogated by Hahn. Bridges was also interviewed with his lawyer and a high-level superior from the U.S. Secret Service multiple times. Bridges and Force intentionally misled and lied to Hahn about their relationship to each other and their involvement with DPR, Silk Road, and Bitcoin. The corruption threatened Barara and Turner's case against Ross. If a jury were to learn the extent of Force and Bridges' involvement in undermining and corrupting the investigation, it would cast strong doubt on their version of events. Ultimately, Turner revealed to the defense that Force was under investigation, but argued to Judge Forrest that no mention of him be made to the jury. Turner's disclosure was functionally the same as no disclosure at all, because Ross and Draytell could not use it at trial. Even more outrageous, Turner hid Bridges' involvement entirely from both Judge Forrest and Draytell. They did not know he existed. Having alerted Carpelas that the U.S. government had him on its radar, and having infiltrated Silk Road, Bridges was ostensibly too entwined with Carpelas for Turner to risk revealing his corruption, even though he was required by law to reveal anything that might be helpful to Ross. On December 15, 2014, a few weeks before trial began, Judge Forrest held a hearing to get to the bottom of this issue. However, she sealed it off from the public. No reporters were allowed to observe, and Ross's family was forbidden to attend. At the hearing, Turner was joined by his co-counsel Timothy Howard. They argued that the investigation into Force's corruption must be kept secret. If Force were to discover that he was a suspect, he might flee, hide money, or destroy evidence. Of course, Force had already known for 8 months that Hahn had him under investigation, and Turner knew that. The only reason for maintaining secrecy was to deprive Ross of the use of the information. "The government misled the court," Draytell said later at a press conference. "The agents knew exactly what they were being investigated for, so the notion that keeping it secret was essential to the investigation, or even helpful to the investigation, was simply not true. This was not the only falsehood that Turner put forth in court. Judge Forrest also asked him how deeply force had penetrated Silk Road when he and Bridges took over Green's admin account. Could he have faked being someone else? The judge asked. No, you can't do that, no, Turner replied. But that's exactly what did happen. Bridges had taken over the accounts of vendors, effectively becoming them online, all while pretending to be Green. He didn't receive root administrative privileges. He didn't have privileges to do anything on the site, Howard went on to say. What was the list of what Green could do? She then asked. He had the ability to reset passwords and PIN numbers. And if he could reset passwords and PIN numbers, could he have utilized their accounts? Could he have reset any password? That's something we would have to confirm and look at, Howard equivocated. Of course, if Force could reset passwords and PINs, he could take over accounts, as he did with the vendors he stole from. In fact, with Green's administrator privileges, Force could have reset the PIN on DPR's account and usurped control of it, even without DPR losing access. He could have changed anything in the Silk Road database, including message texts in the forum or market, all without the government's knowledge of what precisely he did. Turner was determined to keep this information from leaving the sealed hearing or being argued before the jury. He told Judge Forrest deliberate and calculated lies, and she ultimately ruled in favor of the government. This is tactical at this point, Draytell interrupted. It's designed to keep this information from our use at trial that's going to come in 3 weeks, so they can publicize it 2 months down the road when they indict this guy, and we are prohibited from using it in defense. It's just a violation. It would, in fact, be just 7 weeks after Ross's trial that Force and Bridges were indicted, and their corrupt activity on the Silk Road site publicly revealed. Draytell asked that the trial be pushed back until the government had completed its investigation of Force, which would defeat Turner's intention of keeping Force out of Ross's trial. Judge Forrest denied that, too. Chapter 16. Eviscerating the Defense. Robert Murphy, senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, said, The trial was conducted in a manner apparently designed to secure a guilty verdict. Some of the judge's decisions were baffling to any neutral observer. A couple of months before the trial began, Schumer publicly convicted Ross in an open letter to U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, tainting him in the minds of potential New York jurors. The Silk Road was shut down by the FBI, he wrote, and I am pleased that the DOJ is currently prosecuting its operator and holding him accountable. This was despite the foundational tenet of our justice system that a defendant is innocent until proven guilty. Judge Forrest influenced the jurors further, before trial, by anonymizing them, hiding their names from the public and from Ross. This is a rare and extreme measure that communicates to jurors that they must be protected from a dangerous defendant. Consequently, they are prejudiced against him before they even enter the courtroom. By law, the judge may make this decision only after she considers the arguments of the counsel, offers the jurors an explanation that does not cast the defendant in an unfavorable light, and makes her ruling on the record. Judge Forrest did none of this, and actively concealed from the public and Ross the fact that an anonymous jury had been impaneled. Then, with the jury selected, the judge went further and intervened on behalf of the government, telling the jurors that all of the evidence that you are going to need to render a verdict will be received into evidence at this trial. Of course, there is only one party with the burden of proof at trial, and that is the government. So when the judge told the jury they would receive all the evidence they needed, she vouched for the strength and sufficiency of the government's evidence. Around this time, protesters began to demonstrate outside the courthouse, carrying signs like, "Life for a website? Web hosting is not a crime," and other slogans. People also distributed pamphlets informing jurors of their rights, responsibilities, and authority. Judge Forrest took exception to this and threatened to sequester the jury and implement additional procedures unless the demonstrators desisted by the next morning. Draytell argued that this would hurt Ross because it would send jurors the message that Ross was a danger to them. He also argued that Ross had no control over citizens exercising their rights to free speech. However, the judge did not relent, and not wanting to harm Ross, the demonstrators reluctantly disbanded. As trial began, Howard laid the government's case out to the jury in opening arguments. He had to convince them that Ross had not only created Silk Road, but operated it continuously until it was finally taken down 2.5 years later. Ross had to be the only person behind the DPR accounts and responsible for all the drugs and other contraband sold on the site. Howard also had to convince the jury that all the Silk Road files on Ross's laptop were his, that they had not been tampered with or planted there. Turner called Der-Yeghiayan to the stand as the government's first witness. Der-Yeghiayan outlined a sanitized version of his investigation, never mentioning Karpeles and focusing on his role as Cirrus during Ross's arrest. However, Turner's presentation wasn't meeting Judge Forrest's standards. At break, she told Turner that Der-Yeghiayan had described Tor in a way that was just mumbo-jumbo to most people on the jury right now. There is still room for clarity. Turner applied her coaching and began the second day of testimony by having Der-Yeghiayan re-explain what the Tor network was, how it worked, and what it allowed for, complete with a demonstration. This intervention by the judge had a clearly perceptible effect on the quality and clarity of Turner's presentation of evidence from that point forward in the trial. The rules of criminal law require the government to provide certain information to the defendant before trial begins, such as notes and communications the government's witnesses had made during the course of their investigation. Less than 2 weeks before trial began, Turner dumped on Ross and Draytell 5,000 pages of records pertaining to Der-Yeghiayan alone. Buried in this mountain of material was the defense's first glimpse into Der-Yeghiayan's investigation of Karpeles and how McFarland and the rest of the Baltimore office had undermined it and allowed Karpeles to slip away. During cross-examination, Draytell brought up Karpeles and started to explore how Der-Yeghiayan had targeted him. "You wanted to know what was going on with Baltimore," he said to Der-Yeghiayan. "You wanted to know what was going on with the meeting with Karpeles' attorneys. You wanted to know what was out there because you had your own parallel independent investigation of him going on that would be completely wiped out by what Baltimore was doing." "Yes," Der-Yeghiayan replied, "and we had verbal agreements with the attorneys in that district also about that." "And so, in the course of this and in pursuing your investigation, you learned that Karpeles' lawyers had made that offer to the government?" Draytell asked next. But before he could clarify to the jury that Karpeles had offered someone else to target as DPR instead of himself, before he could ask whose name was given, or if that name was Ross Ulbricht, Turner leaped up and began to repeatedly object. Rather than follow the usual protocol and call a private sidebar, Judge Forrest dismissed the jury early and asked Draytell where his questions were leading. "They were going to meet with Karpeles," Draytell explained, "and this meeting was supposed to be in Guam, and I don't know whether this meeting ever occurred." At the mention of Guam, an NSA stronghold, Turner launched into a prolonged argument as to why Karpeles should not be discussed. However, the judge did not see a legal justification for this. "We can all agree it's obviously highly relevant, right?" she said. "If the lead investigator believed in August 2013 that somebody else might be a candidate." Turner would not relent, but the judge could not justify sustaining his objections. "I'm going to allow Draytell to ask what was the basis for Der-Yeghiayan's view that somebody else was an appropriate target," she said. "That strikes me as in the heartland of this defense." Turner then argued that Der-Yeghiayan's investigation, based on government evidence, was irrelevant. I don't think it's irrelevant, Judge Forrest retorted, because if he pursued a target and it wasn't Ross, I think that's directly relevant. They're trying to raise reasonable doubt as to whether or not Ross is the real DPR. How else do you do it? I mean, I haven't even looked at the document extensively, Turner replied. I haven't had a chance to talk to the witness about it. I haven't had a chance. You can't talk to the witness about it anyway during the pendency of an examination, she interrupted. And this is an issue which, in light of the defendant's interest in this, we'll hold it open until Tuesday morning. In papers filed over the weekend, Turner admitted that the meeting with Kay had indeed occurred. However, he claimed that it wasn't Ross's name given, but the name of someone else entirely. When the trial reconvened, the judge had performed a complete about-face. She now ruled that any cross-examination about whether or not Der-Yeghiayan suspected Karpeles or found probable cause to believe he was DPR was off-limits. An interview in which DPR said he took over the site from its previous owner early on was banned from being mentioned to the jury. This was despite Der-Yeghiayan's belief that it was Karpeles speaking as DPR. Draytel was not permitted to ask about how Karpeles gave Kay someone else to target just before Ross was arrested. Essentially, all further testimony regarding an alternate perpetrator was now found to be irrelevant. Judge Forrest went further and struck all Der-Yeghiayan's testimony about Karpeles from the record, preventing it from being built upon with further questioning or used in closing arguments. She instructed the jury to disregard it. I'm not sure I can proceed, Draytel pleaded. Now I have to go back and reconstruct all of this material. I'd like a break until tomorrow. No, replied the judge. I'm done with this issue. I'm not suggesting you should like it or agree with it, but it's how we're going to proceed. She then called in the jury, and Draytel did his best to reintroduce as much as he could of Karpeles' involvement, but to no avail. Turner objected to virtually every question, 100 times to be exact, and Judge Forrest sustained most of them. However, Draytel had other questions for Der-Yeghiayan. Before trial, Turner was required to provide to Ross and his defense all the evidence he had seized or collected in the course of the government's investigation. It amounted to approximately 4 terabytes of information, equivalent to 2 billion typed pages. Despite having just a few months to comb through it, Ross and his team uncovered a conversation between DPR and Force acting as death from above. When Draytel began questioning Der-Yeghiayan about this at trial, Turner was initially taken off guard, as he didn't know about the existence of Force's alias Death from Above. Once he realized that Draytel's questions were leading to Force, Turner objected and got Judge Forrest to prevent Draytel from cross-examining Der-Yeghiayan with respect to communications between DPR and Death from Above. Turner immediately informed Hahn of this new revelation about Force's alias. She retraced Draytel's steps and confirmed that Force was indeed behind the Death from Above account. Turner used Draytel's cross-examination of Der-Yeghiayan to continue his investigation of Force, then blocked it from being used at Ross's trial during the course of the trial itself. At every turn, Turner convinced Judge Forrest to suppress anything that could lead to revealing the truth about Force and Karpeles. This included the conversation between Not Wonderful and DPR. Despite Turner including it in his initial exhibit list, he had it blocked too, realizing that it would hurt his case by showing that DPR was tipped off by corrupt law enforcement. Chapter 17. How Many DPRs? Curtis Green, former Silk Road administrator, said, "Everybody says there were multiple DPRs. Absolutely. I was DPR once. So if I was, who else was?" Will Pangman, Bitcoin and blockchain consultant, said, "It is common knowledge that there was more than one DPR. Anyone who even remotely followed the trial could see that the jury was aggressively obstructed from knowing this, and many other material facts. In addition to preventing any mention of Karpeles, Force, Bridges, or anyone from Baltimore, Turner worked to maintain the narrative that Ross controlled Silk Road from the day he launched it until his arrest, and that he alone was behind the DPR accounts. This was despite the fact that the government's lead investigator, Der-yeghiayan, believed there were multiple DPRs, and revealed this at trial under oath. "You yourself thought that DPR changed over time, didn't you?" Draytell asked him. "You told people inside your organization, HSI, that DPR had changed in April of 2013. I'm not sure if the April I was referring to was 2012 or 2013. Der-yeghiayan hedged. "I think it was April 2012. "But the email was written August of 2013, right? "August, yes. "And when you said it changed in April, you didn't say April a year ago, you just said April, right?" "Yes." "Have you taken any acting courses?" Draytell asked ironically. Beyond Der-yeghiayan's beliefs about when DPR changed, there was concrete evidence supporting the fact that different people were behind the DPR accounts at various times. Andrew Jones, one of DPR's employees who was in custody, admitted this to Turner. Turner revealed to Judge Forrest and Draytell that Jones had in fact communicated with more than one person acting as DPR. In October 2012, Jones and DPR had agreed upon a handshake, a unique question and response that only they would know. If Jones doubted that he was talking to the same DPR, he could ask the secret question to determine if DPR knew the response. Just weeks before Ross was arrested, Jones asked DPR the question, a book recommendation. The same DPR would have known the correct response, anything by Rothbard. But this DPR was unable to provide it. He told Jones what his first job was on Silk Road instead, moderator of the DPR book club on the Silk Road Forum. But this was public knowledge that anyone could know, especially someone who had been around the site for any length of time. As noted earlier, Turner's case hinged on the content of the files they found on Ross's laptop. There were thousands of pages of chat logs on it, including the chat between DPR and Jones from 2012, when they initially set up the handshake. If Ross had actually been DPR, and if it was Ross chatting with Jones just before his arrest, not only would he have known the handshake, he would have known that he kept chat logs of all his conversations. He could have easily and quickly searched for the book recommendation prompt and offered the correct response. The fact that DPR did not know the handshake demonstrated that there was more than one DPR, that DPR's identity changed over time, and that there was a change very close in time to Ross's arrest, all supporting Ross's defense that he had been framed by the genuine DPR. Rather than allow the jury to hear this evidence, Turner removed Jones from his witness list. Draytell called him to the stand instead, but Jones invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, even though he was cooperating with the government and had told them about the failed handshake in the first place. Knowing how important Jones's testimony was to Ross, Turner used it to lure Draytell into giving him a significant concession in exchange for letting Draytell use it at trial without calling Jones to the stand. Then, the night before Draytell sought to finalize and introduce it, Turner reneged at 11:00 p.m. Draytell asked Judge Forrest to intervene, but she denied the application to introduce Jones's statement. In desperation, Draytell tried to expose the political connection between Schumer, Judge Forrest, and Barrara. He began by asking IRS agent Alford, who claimed to have found Ross's email address, about the open letter from Schumer asking that Silk Road be shut down. Before Alford could answer, Turner objected, and Judge Forrest sustained the objection. Draytell argued that the question was relevant because the letter put pressure on law enforcement to shut down Silk Road. It makes it something they want to do as quickly as possible, yet 2.5 years later, Silk Road is still operating. For 3 months, the government can pull the plug at any moment. There is tremendous motivation to find a suspect as quickly as possible and arrest them, regardless of the merits. At this, Judge Forrest became hostile. You've got a view that is frankly rather extraordinary for a person who I know is as intellectual as you. I can't decide if you actually believe that you're right or whether or not you are just taking the position as a zealous advocate. No further mention of Schumer was made. To be continued. Next episode will include chapters 18 and 19, Selling the Story, and Double Life for a Website. For a written version of this episode, plus citations and footnotes, go to freeross.org/railroaded.